Hello students, this is Steve Smith, cross-cultural studies teacher at Heritage Christian School, and I am trying to get some of you online students that are joining us in Mexico this year a little bit up to date with what we've been doing in class. We've been talking about migration from Mexico, not only into the United States, but into Canada as well, especially as part of the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. And we're trying to study that issue just to look at not only our relationship as Canadians with Mexico, but to understand a little bit of the cultural differences that separate Mexico and Canada, and especially in this first lecture, Mexico and the United States. This picture of Nogales, United States, and Nogales, Mexico shows a clear dividing line. That's the border between the two countries. A few things you might notice on the Mexico side as a Coca-Cola poster and a political poster advertising for an election that's happening. But the similarities are quite distinct between the two countries, Mexico being a much poorer country and its political system far less developed and robust than either we find in Canada or the United States. In fact, Mexico really only had its first fair and free election in 2000 with the election of Vicente Fox. And those differences really have their roots in the history and the culture between the two countries. And of course, Canada shares much more with the United States than it does with Mexico. Not only were we colonized, both colonized by the British, we're all colonial subjects at one time until the United States rebelled, had a revolution, and separated from Great Britain. Canada remained loyal. But nonetheless, we have a lot more in common than we do in terms of differences. Mexico, on the other hand, has had a very different historical and cultural trajectory, and we're going to explore that a little bit now in this lecture. Now, if we focus our attention for a moment on the Nogales, USA side of the border, we see a few things that might stand out to you there. A lot of students notice the dirt and the emptiness, and they think, oh, that must be the poorer country. But in fact, you notice hallmarks of industrialization there with machinery and equipment that is able to do a lot more work than you can do with many, many laborers. And that industrialization has its roots in some economic differences between the United States and Mexico. But let's start with some of the democratic development. The English, who colonized North America on the East Coast, in the St. Lawrence area, as well as down the eastern coast of the United States, were relative latecomers to the New World. They had a poor choice of colonies. France quite famously gave up Canada after the war as they negotiated the end of the 7 Years' War in order to hold on to some of its sugar colonies in the Caribbean. Because those colonies were not considered to be tremendously valuable. They were very valuable to the people who migrated there because they were escaping various forms of persecution and economic difficulties in Europe. And it just leads to a very significant difference between the two countries. The Mexicans, famously, as we'll see in one of the movies we look at, enslaved the inhabitants to collect gold. Not the Mexicans, of course, but the Spaniards. And they were very interested in using these colonies to finance empires around the world. And so the collecting of gold and silver and other things and sending it back to the mother country was very important. Whereas the English who came to the United States, what would become the United States, to the British colonies, they were interested in settling and developing a new society there. There's a famous document called the Mayflower Compact, which some of the early settlers signed even before getting off the ship, which indicated that they would make decisions collectively. It was kind of a covenant, an agreement that you'd have government by the people, which of course would eventually develop into a full-fledged democracy in the United States, a desire for rights, political rights and economic rights by the people, something that did not blossom in Mexico until much, much later. So there was no aristocracy to speak of, especially after the British settlers had repelled the English government in 1776, and land was granted to ordinary people as the American government spread out west. You had many people that were granted land, and the result was a kind of an entrepreneurial attitude among the ordinary people of the United States, a sense of individual entitlement, especially with land, but also in terms of political rights. This is something that never happened in Mexico. You had much more of an aristocracy, a traditional European top-down form of government, where a very few people ruled over very many others. When the gold and the silver seemed to be running out, they set up plantation type of agriculture, and Mexico really kept that aristocratic political structure until much later than the United States. Now, of course, American democracy wasn't perfect, especially in the South, where they began importing Africans to do the work on the plantations of tobacco and cotton and other crops. And of course, women never had the vote until the 20th century, and African Americans never got the vote in practice until the Civil Rights Movement late in the 20th century. But the seeds of democracy, of economic rights, political rights, of religious rights, those were entrenched in the United States early, and they would have their fruition, of course, in making it a much freer and open society than Mexico would ever know. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, the Spanish developed an encomienda system, which was really just a way to tax the local population by forcing them to labor for aristocratic miners or aristocratic farmers, so that they developed an economy that was based essentially on a kind of slave labor. The conquistadors were granted large tracts of land by the Spanish government, and you very quickly set up a new aristocracy where that kind of political government was never seen in any way in America. To some extent, we saw it in the early French settlements, but of course, the French rule was dismissed around 1763. So Mexico has had this class system, even a caste-based system in terms of race, identifying who were the rulers and who were the servants from very early on. Though Mexico achieved independence from Spain in about 1821, they merely replaced one autocratic leader with another. The form of government remained very much a kind of dictatorship where there was no sense of individual rights, economically, politically, or religiously. There was much more of a socialist revolution, early 20th century, but the result of that revolution, like other socialist revolutions, created a party, socialist party, which took over the government and essentially stayed in power for the next 75 years. So you never had in Mexico a sense of individual um, equality before the law, with the rule of law making all people um, political equals, if not economic equals. Just quickly through this slide, it simply shows what is called the casta system of Mexico, where it begins with the European Spaniards at the top of the system, and it's basically a color bar as you get further down the system to the darker races, to the native inhabitants, and especially with the importation of African slaves that was happening in the later 1600s and 1700s. You end up with not just a class-based system in terms of economics, but a caste-based system where economics and race overlap. Now I realize we're excuse me, covering a lot of history in a short time here, but this is just to give us a general overview of why Mexico is so different today, though so close to the United States. The idea of land rights, of free trade, of creating hundreds and then eventually thousands of small entrepreneurs in the United States who would develop a system based upon Adam Smith's idea that mercantilism was outdated and that you needed to have a free trade system to allow ordinary people to participate in the economy. This led to a massive expansion of the American economy. Individuals participating at all levels and not merely having a few very wealthy elite controlling the economy. That, of course, combined with the religious and political ideals of democracy, meant that everyone saw real potential in the system to get ahead in life. You might want to call it the early American dream, the idea that if you work hard, the government would respect your individual rights and you could get ahead, whether that's as a farmer, a small businessman, or a large farmer. And this led to having people very vested, very committed to both the economic and the political system of the United States. We see that the presidents that were elected sought to protect these ideals so that when you had corruption that was beginning to develop in the American system, where at times a few large economic stakeholders would have too much sway over the system, presidents like Jackson, like Lincoln, like both Teddy and FDR would intervene to reset the economy in terms of allowing all people to participate in the economy, to protect the political rights of ordinary individuals. America kept its democratic form. It never developed into a plutocracy, though some would argue that it is today because you have a very small percentage controlling most of the wealth in the United States. But it was for most of its development a system that people believed in, ordinary people believed in, and wanted to participate in, and found their upward mobility was possible. It wasn't a class system like you had in Europe, where if you were born the son of a baker, you would be a baker. Here, if you were born the son of a baker, someday you might become president, just as we saw many presidents come from rather humble origins in the United States. Along with the development of capitalism was a development of technology that allowed capital to produce much better means of production. So there was an investment in technology and machinery to improve the economy, to improve the productivity of the individual worker, and this economic growth would eventually make the United States the leading power, the leading economic power in the world by around the year 1900. Okay. In Mexico, on the other hand, you had a population unaware of the idea of political rights, or at least unable to achieve those political rights in any practical form. There was uprisings, there was rebellions against the government, but the government tended to win. The government tended to put down these rebellions until the socialist revolution of the early 1900s. But even then, the idea of democracy was held back because the socialist government felt they needed total control to implement their plan, something that we saw with many other socialist countries around the world at that time. While the USA industrialized, Mexico turned towards an agricultural economy with large plantations owned by large landholders. And whereas in the United States, 75% of the population owned land that they could farm and utilize for economic development. In Mexico, it was only 2.4% of the population. And so that in itself indicates how strong the aristocratic entrenchment was in Mexico. If we return to that idea of the casta system inside Mexico, that system developed because you had a much larger population of indigenous people in Mexico. Indigenous groups like the Maya, the Inca, the Aztecs, the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, and many others were much more populous. And whereas in the United States you had some sedentary groups that were farming corn, like the Huron and other groups in the east, the Nootka and the Salish, of course, on the west coast were sedentary groups, but you had many nomadic groups that whose claim to land was difficult because they were always wandering groups, and the result was that these groups were unable to control or claim land in the face of a massive growth of European population. In the United States, eventually, you would have only 4% of the United States population as indigenous people. In Mexico, even as late as 1825, it's 60% of the population. These large indigenous populations would become workers on the Mexican farms, plantations, whereas in the USA, the indigenous population is largely driven from the land in favor of agricultural and industrial development by the Europeans as they spread westward. If you think about the difference in many ways between America and and Mexico, it's a lot like the difference between the northern United States and the southern United States before the Civil War. The southern U.S. was an agricultural economy, whereas the northern states had industrialized and were producing much more economic output per worker than could be done in the South, where agricultural labor was needed, and the cheapest, of course, was slave labor. And that meant that the northern states outstripped the economic development of the southern states and were eventually able to dominate them. Of course, there is a legal and political and religious motivation for ending slavery in the South, but it combines with an economic reality that the South was simply economically backward compared to the northern states. Today, that's what we see as the difference between Mexico and the United States, whereas Mexico relies much more on agricultural products to sustain its economy. The U.S. is a very thoroughly industrialized economy, so that even its agriculture is largely machine run in a very industrialized format. This slide simply suggests that the Mexicans, many of them longed for a kind of economy and a political system that they had in the United States, but it would be a long time coming. As I suggested, not until about the year 2000 did they achieve a democratic government. The result of some of these cultural and historical differences are very different societies today. The economic wealth of the USA, if we look at it in terms of per capita income, shows that the average U.S. citizen makes about $52,000 a year, whereas the average Mexican makes only about $9,600 a year. The life expectancy is better. It's best in Canada, of course. The poverty, the percentage of people at the poverty line is highest in Mexico, but of course if you used a U.S. standard, that would be a much greater number of Mexicans would be below the poverty line. And Mexico is also a very unequal society. It's a society where very much of the wealth is concentrated in very few hands. It's a country of extremes where you have some incredibly wealthy people next door, neighbors with many poor people. If you look at the educational differences between the countries as well, very few, comparatively very few Mexicans graduate with a grade 12 education compared to what you see in the United States and Canada. This is just a quick slide to show that if you have an economy that's based in agriculture, you're going to have a relatively low per capita income, because agricultural products cannot compete with industrial products. Industrial products are constantly getting better and improving, and when you sell them, you're always selling new products where the price gradually goes up. When you're in an agricultural economy, the more of a product that you produce, the lower the price goes. And so attempting to catch up with an industrialized country as an agricultural country is very, very difficult. We call it the scissors crisis, because you tend to see a declining income per capita as you have more people in agriculture, and a rising income per capita as you have more people working in the industrialized or the service economy. This graph simply shows that even over the last 30 or 40 years, we see a growth in the American economy, so that individual workers are doing better. Though this graph doesn't actually show, this is a per capita graph, because if you actually looked at the lower classes in America, they're not doing as well as the upper classes are. So this is dividing all the wealth by the number of people in the country. But it does show you that relative to Mexico, the United States workers are doing better as time goes on, whereas in Mexico, you have a very flat line and things are not improving as time goes on into the 21st century. This is a population pyramid comparing the United States and Mexico. There's a lot to say about these pyramids, but just very quickly, you notice that you have a lot more percent of the population as children in Mexico. Excuse me. Whereas in the United States, as a developed country, they're having fewer children per person or per woman, because in an industrialized economy, in an urban economy, you don't need as many children, nor do you have as many children dying, so you're not having more children to replace children that may die, as you do in underdeveloped economies where they're agriculturally based and you need a lot of workers, so you have a lot of children, and you tend to have a higher infant mortality rate, and so you're often having children. There's a tradition of having many children so that you can replace those who may not survive into adulthood. So the result is a higher dependency ratio. You have many more children depending on fewer workers in the middle. You also have fewer people surviving into old age because of the difficulties of life in those poorer economies, and it just shows a clear contrast between the two countries, economically speaking, by looking at their demographics. Okay, this graph is bringing us up into the 21st century, and what it shows are rates of homicide in the different countries. And if you picked a point in time and said, beginning at this time, let's watch what happens to the murder rate over time. So we assume that all the countries don't begin at the same starting point, but we're simply looking at their rates over time. So beginning at a common point in 1990, we see the murder rate in Canada, the pink line, rises a little bit and then plunges continually, despite the fact that Stephen Harper went on a prison building binge. We have actually had fewer and fewer violent crimes in Canada over the last 20 and 25 years. Similar situation in the USA, where violent crime has actually been falling over the last 20 and 25 years. In Mexico, however, we had falling homicide rates up until about the year 2006. There was an election in 2006, and the promise of the new president was that he would have a war on drugs. This was done to a large extent to make American political leaders happy, and the result was a war between the cartels and between the government and the cartels. And so the murder rates spiked disastrously, giving Mexico the image of being an incredibly violent place. And that is true in some places in Mexico, especially along the northern border in places like Juarez. But in most places in Mexico, it's not nearly the situation that we see in places like Juarez or Acapulco or some of the drug centers in Mexico. So that just tells you that being a very violent society, there might be reason for many people to be looking to migrate out of Mexico and into the United States. This graph from Statistics Canada, 2011, just confirms this, that the murder rate in Mexico is about almost 5 times what it is in the United States, which compared to Canada is a much more violent society and has a murder rate of almost 4 times what it is in Canada. This graph doesn't quite indicate that, but you can see the difference between the 3 countries. The result of this is, again, just the pressure for people to migrate to a safer place to live and work and have a secure future for their children. These statistics just help us understand some of the pressure that's in some of these Latin American countries to get out, to find a safer place to live and work and raise a family. We see many, many children. I don't know if you remember news reports from around 2014 of the sudden influx of unaccompanied minors into the United States. It has to do with a number of factors, not only the violence of those societies, not only the poverty of those societies, but also the fact that they're seemed to be an opportunity for these children to be reunited with their parents under some new legislation introduced by the Obama administration. And so the number of children migrating alone into the United States to be reunited with their families grew exponentially over this time. You notice with Mexico it actually shrinks a little bit. A lot of those children were coming from Honduras and other countries where there's also drug problems and poverty problems, trying to get reunited with families in the United States. This is a slide that just shows a similar kind of information on the spike in child migrants to the United States in the years 2009 to 2014. We watched some clips from a film available on Netflix called Which Way Home, and it's a documentary film just following several child migrants trying to get into the United States. A very difficult film because it shows the poverty of these children, it shows the difficulties of their lives, and it just helps us understand why there's so much pressure for people in these countries to desire to find safe places to live in the United States and Canada. This slide simply shows that there's a revolving door for most migrants at the border, that the percentage that actually stay once they cross the border is very small. It's growing, again, because of some of the legislative changes that happen in the U.S., but most try to get in, spend less than a week, and are bounced back into Mexico, deported, and they will try again very quickly to get back into the country, as you can see on the next slide. This slide simply shows that once they are deported to Mexico, and sometimes to Honduras or El Salvador or other countries, they are asked, how long will you wait to try again to get into the United States? And the large majority says they will try again almost immediately. So there's a real push of a huge population of Spanish-speaking people from all these countries trying to find a new home, a new way of life in the United States. And this should help us understand why so many people are so eager to come to Canada for work. And when they come to Canada, they're far more used to difficult situations, to having no political rights, to being treated with less respect by their governments, and thus when they come to Canada, they're much more willing to work for lower wages, to put up with more abuse and more difficulties at work. And what we're trying to understand is how the Canadian migrant labor programs compare to what we see in the United States. And a great film that shows the difficulties of the migrant labor system in the United States is called Food Chains, that demonstrates how most of the food grown in the southern United States, even up in Washington and Oregon nowadays, is grown by migrant laborers. And some of them are documented and are able to live in the United States, but many of them are undocumented and illegal workers. And yet they are working for wages in the United States that are far less than the average American makes, and they have far less legal protection than the average American has. And so this is what we're trying to understand in terms of how Canada's migrant labor policies, especially with the Temporary Foreign Workers Program and another program called the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, compare to the United States. Just a couple more quick graphs here that just show that every year there are many deaths inside the United States as migrants cross the border, across the river into the United States. And a rising homicide rate, as we already looked at in Mexico, um, and they're subject to many difficulties along the way. So if they escape through Mexico, some of these people from Honduras or Costa Rica or El Salvador, and make it into um, the United States, they may actually even still have difficulty surviving because there are many border guards in the United States trying to track them, and so they try to travel through the deserts and very difficult places to get into the United States, and many of them die in those deserts. A fascinating documentary put out by PBS television is called The Undocumented, and just follows some of the families that are victims of this problem in the United States. But many people are also murdered along the way in Mexico as they try to get through Mexico into the United States, because migrant workers traveling the trains, of course, are very vulnerable, subject not only to economic exploitation but to all kinds of abuses. Especially the women, who are more vulnerable, are subject to all kinds of sexual exploitation and abuse along the way. This graph gives us a quick history of the story of immigration from Mexico into the United States. So you'll notice from the graph that the push for entry into the United States is a relatively recent thing. The United States is a very different culture, a very different environment, and culturally speaking, most Latin Americans, most Mexicans, and people from other countries would prefer to stay in cultures that were similar to their own. But when the economic pressure increases, they are forced to move, and that's what's really happening, especially in the 80s and 90s, as the trade agreements limited what Mexicans could grow, what kind of work they could do, and so more and more of them um, were forced into the United States to look for work. NAFTA, signed in eventually in 1993, was a major factor in this, because the United States began shipping much of its excess corn into Mexico, which had grown corn on small-scale agricultural farms for many years. The average Mexican could make a living farming corn and other products. But when these products began to be dumped into the Mexican economy, these guys were put out of work, and so many of these farmers began drifting into the United States to look for work instead. So that's what's partly responsible for the massive influx of immigration that we see over the last 20 and 30 years. These workers that migrate temporarily or permanently to the United States are very important to the Mexican economy, because they can't work at home. They migrate to the United States, get work, and send that money back. So remittances from the United States to Mexico are a huge part of their economy, because being unable to work in Mexico, they come to the United States and send the money home. And this means that in Mexican elections, immigration issues are huge, because all the candidates realize how important it is to keep this money flowing from the United States, even though those workers are illegal. So those are billions of dollars that are flowing back from the United States to Mexico. Again, a similar graph showing migration from Mexico to the U.S. There was times when that was higher during the boom in the American economy in the early 1900s. As that boom wore off into the dirty 30s, it shrank, of course, and then NAFTA in 1993, or the potential for NAFTA to be signed even, caused a huge influx of immigrants from Mexico to the United States, and that trend has continued into the current time. If you click on this resource, you'll see that it attempts to show pictorially how Mexican immigrants have made up an increasing important part of the overall migration to the United States. that at times that migration was dominated by Europeans, Irish specifically, or Germans, or even British citizens, sometimes Scandinavian, sometimes Italian, sometimes um, even Eastern European. But over time, the the number of migrants from Mexico has increased, and now is kind of the dominant factor in considering immigrants to the United States. You have to click on that and go to that site to watch how that map changes over time. Notice on this graph simply the doubling of Mexican migration into the United States. Before 1980 it was comparatively low. It doubled by 1990 with the looming NAFTA agreement, and then doubled again in the next decade, and continued to increase for the next 10 years. And today it is beginning to shrink slightly, but still it is the overwhelming um, major factor in overall migration to the United States right now. This graph just simply shows the darker colors are areas where most or a larger number of migrants per capita are coming. You get a lot more migrants from the southern territories. These are sometimes called the Indian territories, or they have higher populations of indigenous people, less industrialized, agriculturally based workers, and so they migrate, being poorer and also knowing some farming skills. They migrate to the U.S. to take part in the production of tomatoes um, and other kinds of crops all the way through California into Oregon and Washington. And specifically, you should take note of Oaxaca down there in the south. That's the state that we are visiting each year with our grade 12 program, and they say as many as 1 out of 3 of the people traveling to the U.S. border every year are from Oaxaca or Chiapas, these two most southernmost states. What do these workers do when they get to the United States, especially these unauthorized workers who are simply crossing the border looking for work? They are largely in industries that they're used to, such as farming, or they take up simple service jobs. Most of these people, most of these unauthorized immigrants, the large majority, over 90%, do not speak fluent English, and the result is they get the most menial kinds of jobs, the most labor-based jobs, and the result is they're most vulnerable to exploitation in these jobs as well. To return for a moment to that NAFTA agreement that was signed in 1993, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, one of the things it did was allow the U.S. to open factories inside Mexico and produce products right along the border in factories that could access low-wage labor inside Mexico. And the other thing it did was make it difficult for Mexicans to make a living in their traditional ways of farming, such as growing products like corn, which were dumped in large amounts into their economy. And so we see a shift from legal immigrants to the United States to illegal immigrants. And most of these people coming and working on the farms in the United States are illegal immigrants nowadays. And the result is they are much more open to exploitation in terms of low wages and in terms of having their rights overlooked or trampled upon by their employers. Again, this simply shows again that the number of unauthorized immigrants has increased uh, uh, consistently over the last number of years, to the point that it's now overtaken legal immigration from Mexico. Same sort of statistics on this graph as um, workers come in on legal programs, such as the seasonal agricultural workers. Um, that those numbers are decreasing because those workers tend to have more rights. They tend to have better pay. So it's better to get cheaper illegal immigrants to do your work, and thus we see the number of illegal immigrants increasing while the number of legal migrant workers is decreasing. A pattern that we're seeing also in Canada. This graph simply shows that farm workers or service workers, cooking burgers or changing sheets in hotels, these workers are paid far less, and those are the kinds of jobs that the Mexican migrants are taking, especially the illegal migrants who are unable to speak the language, unable to be aware of their rights, or unable to claim legal support for some of the injustices that occur to them. Again, another graph just showing that in terms of the total population of farm workers in the United States, a growing percent are illegal immigrants. Some of them are coming on temporary visas to work in seasonal agricultural programs, as we see in Canada as well. Some of them are citizens, but a growing amount are illegal. And the large majority of those workers are Mexican, coming from directly across the border. That's all this graph shows to us. The graph in the bottom right is simply showing that the number of temporary foreign workers coming to Canada is outstripping the number of people coming to Canada temporarily for other reasons. We have students, we have sometimes refugees coming to Canada temporarily, and we're having more and more temporary foreign workers coming to Canada. The upper left simply shows that in some places like Leamington, Ontario, where the story El Contrato, which is a film that you'll watch to understand the temporary foreign workers program in Canada, in that town, almost 10%, actually I think it might be as high as 10% nowadays, of the population in that town during the agricultural season is made up of temporary foreign workers, most of those being Mexicans. And so Canada is seeing a huge rise in temporary foreign workers, and also a rise in illegal workers, but we're just focused on the legal work migrants coming to Canada for these programs. Temporary foreign workers allow businesses to have a cheaper labor force. It allows businesses to have a cheaper labor force. It allows businesses to have a more compliant labor force. Sometimes it allows them to have workers who don't know their rights and don't complain as much. And so the result is we see temporary foreign workers as a percent of immigrants going way up in Canada, while the legal immigrants coming to work here, having the same rights and wages as Canadians, is actually flattening out. This graph simply shows that a lot of those temporary foreign workers are coming to BC. We have a shrinking share going to Ontario, and we had a growing share coming to BC, but it has tailed off in recent years, but I think we'll see that increase again. Similar kind of graph, just showing how temporary foreign workers are outstripping legal migrants because it is far cheaper to have workers come in, have Mexicans come in and do the labor, than it is to have immigrants come in and become citizens with all the same rights and responsibilities as other Canadian citizens. As far as we're concerned here in BC, we're just interested in the number of Mexicans that are coming in, and we see that that share is becoming increasingly large as a number of temporary foreign workers.